Ruston officials have confirmed that recycling will be suspended August 1st. Charles Burkett spoke to the mayor about its future.
We have spent the last 5 weeks trying to find, and our staff, trying to find another place that would take our recycling that was in a drivable, we don't want to have to ship something 5 or 6 hours away.
Once the vendor in Texas shut down due to a fire at their facility, they immediately started searching for a new vendor. The mayor says they were trying to avoid shutting down recycling services. Several factors enter into their decision. One is the location of the vendor.
It was going 2 hours. We'd like to find something closer.
The other issue,
some couldn't handle the volume that we have. We have about 150 tons of recycling per year.
They look for facilities in Northeast Louisiana, but it would need to be worth that company's bottom line.
We've talked to several who will consider it if there were 4 or 5 or 6 cities in North Louisiana that were recycling. That would help a lot.
Owner of the Herd Freight House Food Truck Park, Desi Bourgeois, is from Austin, where recycling is mandatory. It is something he hopes will return soon.
We're going to be in a suspension of recycling services for approximately 8 months, is my understanding. And that's unfortunate for us and just for everybody in town who's gotten used to the fact that we can recycle here.
Recycling makes sense to him.
We're big, giant civilizations, populations of people that create huge amounts of waste, and we have to deal with those some way.
In Ruston, Charles Burkett, KNOE 8 News.